The Senate's top Republican, Mitch McConnell, shooting down Senator Lindsey Graham's bill that would ban abortions nationwide after 15 weeks of pregnancy.
In terms of scheduling, I think most of the members of my conference prefer that this be dealt with at the state level.
So as McConnell said there, this bill runs counter to the views or the statements made by many Republicans who have said publicly that the issue of abortion should be left up to the states, including Graham himself. This is what the South Carolina senator said in August and what he said yesterday.
I've been consistent. I think states should decide the issue of marriage and states should decide the issue of abortion. I have respect for South Carolina. South Carolina voters here, I trust, to define marriage and to deal with the issue of abortion. I think we should have a law at the federal level that would say after 15 weeks, no abortion on demand, except in cases of rape, incest, to save the life of the mother. And that should be where America's at.
All right, joining me now, CNN political commentator Margaret Hoover, CNN senior political analyst John Avlon, and CNN political commentator and former White House communications director Alyssa Farah Griffin. Before we talk about the potential political impact of what Lindsey Graham is doing here, I want someone to take a stab at maybe what's driving him to do this, Margaret, and you volunteered for that.
I volunteer. I signed up. The rule in almost all things in life is when you're in a hole, stop digging, okay? Republicans are in a hole on the issue of choice, on Dobbs, on the overturning of Roe v. Wade. This is not going well. What we can see from all of the polling and from all of the voter registration, especially with women in key states in this election, is that the gains that Democrats have made has blunted, severely blunted potentially, the advantage Republicans had historically going into this election. All right? So what Mitch McConnell needs Lindsey Graham to stop doing is talking about abortion. And what Lindsey Graham is trying to do is talking about the very specific slice of the issue that Republicans win on, which is when you talk about late-term abortion. And Republicans are losing because the entire debate is now about the fact that women have lost a right that they had for 50 years because of a conservative court.
It's interesting. Sorry.
No, I'll say the timing also, as a Republican, was frustrating because yesterday these terrible inflation numbers come out. That's what Republicans need to be running on ahead of the midterms, is to say the economy is still struggling. The Inflation Reduction Act hasn't done enough yet to drive down inflationary costs. But instead, Lindsey Graham consumes the whole news cycle by basically going rogue against what's been Republican orthodoxy, which is this should be determined by states. Yeah. He's now saying, oh, let's make this a federal issue. Let's take it up. McConnell's smart to not bring it up. That will just absolutely cripple.
It's also not even a real bill. Let's be clear. Like, if you really want to pass a bill, you get Mitch McConnell on your side first. You don't surprise him with a press conference with all of the activist groups and special interests on the far right.
But, I mean, the question is why Lindsey Graham is walking across the street to punch himself in the face. I mean,
Poor Lindsey.
Well, that's precisely
That was
what he's
a
doing
little
to the
tough.
Republican Party right here. You know, he's hanging a lantern on the fact that there's complete hypocrisy on the issue of states' rights. This is the opposite of states' rights. This is the entire argument that the Republicans have been making for a long time. This shouldn't be decided by the courts. It should be decided by state-to-state position. We just saw Lindsey Graham himself made in August, and now he's reversing it. And you know, yes, there are exceptions for rape, incest, and life of the mother, which a lot of these state provisions don't do. But if this is an attempt to excite the base, I think they're already pretty fired up, but it hangs a lantern on their problem, and that doesn't help in this case.
You were going to say?
Conservatives are for the states determining it, unless, of course, Congress were to pass a federal bill. What they were never for was for the court determining it on behalf of
I know, but it's functionally the same thing. It undercuts the argument.
Again, I just want to know, my first question was why Lindsey Graham is doing this, and I'm still not satisfied that there's a clear answer.
Well,
go ahead.
I mean, look, what we know about this issue, which is a very difficult issue, is that actually the country is mostly united, right? No, most people don't want late-term abortions. Most people also want restrictions around the early stage, restrictions but protections, frankly, around the ability for women to have an abortion in the first trimester and early term. We're all mostly agreed about that, but the Republican Party has staked out an extreme position, and they're losing on it. So if they talk about the part that everybody agrees with, perhaps Lindsey thinks this will help help change the issue and change the conversation around Republicans losing on the issue?
My best interpretation of what Lindsey Graham is doing is he's kind of pulling back a relic from the era when Roe was still the law of the land, which my party regularly voted on what we called the pain-capable abortion bill, which would bar abortion. It was actually after 20 weeks, is my recollection of it, because there's science that shows that a baby in the womb could feel pain. That's an 80% position. Most people believe in some access, but some restrictions on abortion. However, now that after the Dobbs decision, Republicans' position was this should be determined by the states. So then to come in and introduce this federal rule, potential law around abortion is just negating the entire argument we've been making.
One of the things that was said by some Republicans is, no, there won't be a national abortion ban. And what's Lindsey Graham saying?
There's going to be a national abortion
No,
ban.
he's saying we're going to pass it.
Which is functionally saying the same thing. Look, as with most things, there is a centrist solution that could unite the vast majority of the American people, but the extremes keep hijacking the argument.
Oh, thanks, John Avalon.
You're welcome.
And by the way, where's Lindsey Graham on abortion? Because now Chuck Schumer, or I'm sorry, not abortion, but codifying marriage equality, because Chuck Schumer is now committed to bringing that up. Many Republicans who don't want to federally have said it's a states issue, so that could come into conflict.
And just if you're a Democrat right now, planning on what to do with this, what's your next step?
Just
Put a
keep
bow on
them talking about it.
Yeah.
Just keep let them going. Just keep giving them all the
gave you a
rope they
gift.
need to hang themselves.
He gave you a gift.
It was a gift.
It was unfortunately it was a gift to Democrats. I think that the Republicans need to just be focusing on the economy, and it took the wind out of the sails of what was frankly not a great event for Biden at the White House yesterday. It was this weird, why did we have James Taylor there to celebrate the economy's not doing very well, continuing to go forward with the event after having these bad inflation numbers? That's where the party should be. Unfortunately, we're running on election denialism and, restricting access to
I'm
abortion.
tempted to say there's never a bad time to hear Fire and Rain, but that seemed a little.
Fair.
But no, look, obviously, Republicans want to be talking about inflation and crime, and so Lindsey Graham does them no help. But also, Republican primary voters aren't actually helping their case either, as we saw last night.
Okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what happened in New Hampshire. Now, we should note that they are still counting votes in New Hampshire, but that one candidate in the Republican Senate primary has conceded. The state Senate President Chuck Morse, who was backed by the establishment, including the governor, Chris Sununu, backed by establishment Republican money, a lot of it, conceded to Don Bolduc, a retired brigadier general who is seen as, very Trumpy, for lack of a better word there. So what does this tell us, Alyssa?
Well, it just shows the overwhelming MAGA control over the party. Now, let's take a step back. Chris Sununu would have been the best recruit to beat Maggie Hassan in New Hampshire, but he didn't want to run. Why would a very popular governor who could stay in his seat forever, basically, want to run for the Senate in this environment? So now we've got somebody who almost guarantees an uphill battle for Republicans to flip that seat. Also, New Hampshire won. Carolyn Leavitt, who worked for me, I was a Matt Mowers backer in this race. He did not deny the election. He's somebody who would have been a stronger general election candidate against Chris Pappas, this further right candidate, Caroline, who I wish all the best, who's going to have now an uphill battle in a seat that Republicans could have flipped.
I mean, I think it does folks almost a disservice to say they're Trumpy. I mean, let's talk about what that means. That means election denial is a litmus test. That means in the case of the new candidate who worked for you, that she thinks that Joe Biden should be impeached. Reflexively, that's a new standard. In the case of this retired general, he's saying, calling the incredibly popular Chris Sununu, the governor of the state, a communist sympathizer. I mean, we're talking detached from reality, as well as the vast majority of voters in New Hampshire, where plurality of voters are registered independents.
And there was good turnout there, so a lot of independents may have very well shown up to vote in this. I do want to pose one question here, because one thing the media, I think, has criticized a great deal what Democrats have done in a lot of these races, which is put money in there behind to try to boost the election denier candidates, right? And if we can put back on the screen the margins right now in that Senate race, you can see that Don Bolduc is only winning by a very little bit there. So you might think that whatever Democratic money was put into the race may have been decisive there. The Democrats are getting what they want. They may be criticized. I'm not putting a value judgment on it. There's been a lot of talk about whether it's the right or wrong thing to do. All I'm saying is they're getting what they want here up and down the board in New Hampshire.
That chapter is not finished, because the end of the book is in November. They have to win against those election denying primary candidates. Then that's the end of the story. If this isn't an advertisement for moderate Republicans to really reflect on how to reform the primary system so that they can get competitive candidates that can win nationally, I don't know what is. I will say I've been saying this for 6 years.
How's that going for you?
It's not going that well. It's weirdly bringing me closer to John Avlon's centrist position. But truly, I mean, there is a real opportunity to look. I mean, look at ranked choice voting. We've got to keep our eye on that in Alaska as that's coming up. Maybe that keeps somebody like Sarah Palin from taking that seat back.
Well,
and
we're
then then there will be a playbook.
We're getting a royal hook here, guys. I thank you, one and all. I do support anything that brings you two closer together. Thank you very much.